Hey everyone, it's Friday, August 5th. Let's talk PlayStation. Once again, kind of a slow news week, but we still find some things to talk about, like PlayStation Now. So just recently in Europe, Sony added 59 new titles to PlayStation Now, bringing the service over to 300 in that region. In North America, they added 15 new, specifically just RPG games for August. So now that's bringing the service to, I believe they're well over 400 titles now in North America. So just kind of mentioning that, I guess. It's one of those things, again, where, like, I know a lot of people dislike PlayStation Now, and it's, you know, I understand that because it's streaming, and if you don't have the connection necessary to sustain it, it's of no use to you whatsoever. And of course, the prices aren't necessarily totally favorable if you compare them to other monthly services like Netflix or Hulu, but people still don't seem to understand the concept that these are games and not necessarily they shouldn't necessarily be considered in the same, you know, medium of TV and movies and all that, you know, shit. So, I don't know. I still kind of feel like it's actually a pretty decent value now, even though it is, like, I believe it's $20 a month in America. And I forget what it is offhand for Europe, but I know it's obviously, like, a little more costly compared to most other services. But either way, these are still full games and everything, and you know, they are adding a lot more titles to it. So it's not like the worst service in the world, but they are making it slightly better over time. And it's just one of those long-term things where I think, you know, say 3-4 years from now, I think PlayStation Now is going to be a lot more attractive. And if it was, like, say, a much more competitive price within lines of, say, Netflix and Hulu, like $10 flat, like, I think then there's, like, pretty much no argument against it. All right, so this we, like, pretty much never talk about, but I still find it a little interesting. So Sony actually just recently canceled Powers. Powers is the original PlayStation series that they did for about 2 seasons now. So the only way you could watch this series was to watch it from a PlayStation. So they were trying original programming. They've done this before, actually, on PlayStation 3 through PSN. They actually did 3 seasons of The Tester, if you remember that, which was kind of a little Sony reality series. That was certainly a little interesting. I'm sure they had good numbers from that to do 3 seasons of it, and of course it promoted, you know, kind of just PlayStation brand loyalty and everything like that. Like, it was very PlayStation-esque, of course, because it was about getting a job at Sony. But Powers was, you know, actual legit writers in the industry, basing it on an original, like, you know, storyline and everything. So, and they are canceling it after season 2. So, you know, apparently there were, like, decent numbers. I mean, what they're saying right now is that it's not, like, for legit canceled. There's still possibly hope for season 3. But, and, you know, it's not something, I didn't necessarily watch it. I don't know if any of you guys did. But it goes back to the PlayStation Now thing. Like, this is another thing that for Sony, it was, like, definitely, like, a long-term thing, you know, especially with PlayStation Vue. And we'll talk about this later in a later news story, but it's like PlayStation's making Sony, like, the most money. And so they're just doing every single avenue they can to expand upon PlayStation and make it their big cash cow, and it is their big cash cow currently, which is why Sony Corporation as a whole is focusing all the resources into more PlayStation stuff. People see something like Powers and they think, this is, you know, I don't want more TV. Why didn't you just invest more money into video games? But it's like they already own the most developers in this industry out of all the hardware manufacturers, and then some. You know, they already own all the most developers, and they have all these extra resources that they can invest into doing things like, say, PlayStation Vue and an original TV series. So it's not necessarily about not using that money for Powers. It's about the fact that they do have that money to do Powers, and they still have all this money to do games as well. So kind of I'm surprised they did cancel it. I guess the numbers weren't that great for them. Maybe PlayStation Vue isn't doing as well as they thought, but yeah, it's like, who knows where they're going to be 5 years from now with, like, all these extra services and all these extra ventures. We all know PlayStation's doing very well. PlayStation's probably going to be doing very well in the next 5 years, but these extra ventures remains to be seen. So this past week, Sony detailed the amount of space that you need for PlayStation VR. At the very least, the amount of space that they recommend, which of course is always going to be a very generous amount. So they're recommending 60 square feet of play area, where it's basically pretty open, so you can sit in the middle, nothing else is around you, and of course it's detailing the distance for the PlayStation camera and how far and wide the PlayStation camera can actually read you. It's just like one of the recommended things. Of course, it's like, again, they're recommending a pretty generous amount of space. They also recommended, I believe, the same amount of space for PlayStation Move at the time. It's just one of those things where they're going to give you, like, the largest number, but obviously you could probably do just fine in, like, sort of a more cramped quarters. Which my room, for example, isn't necessarily the great, like, super large. I got a desk right here. and other stuff over there, which you can't even see off camera, which I do got to do a new room tour video. I actually haven't done that yet since I actually moved into this place, which I've actually been here for a few months now. But this place is small, and PlayStation VR is going to be like fine, and it's going to be fine for people that are, say, in dorm rooms or just have a small bedroom, or obviously like a living room would be the most ideal situation. And they're also discussing how it's like, oh, you know, if the VR title requires you to stand, be well aware of your surroundings, but most titles we'd prefer you to sit. Just one of the recommendations. But like we were mentioning earlier, let's go into our main news story, which is Sony Financials. We always love talking about Sony Financials, and let's talk it again now. We got some new numbers for you. So for Sony's first fiscal quarter, they made $3.2 billion in revenue from games and network services. This is up 14.5% from the same period last year. Gaming made up 78% of Sony's $546 million quarterly profit. Overall financials are down 10.8% from last year. And Sony kind of course, detailed a number of these things, and mostly saying that since they are down, it's more or less due to all their other business ventures, and they're saying that gaming is pretty much offsetting those losses that they were making in their other ventures. So, like we were talking about earlier, PlayStation makes the most money for Sony. We've been talking about this for the longest time now, and it's a very real thing. Sony Corporation for a long time, and of course, obviously before they were even making the first PlayStation, they were an electronics company. They were making all sorts of things, and their staples were not PlayStation. They were like the Walkman and their phones and all the other services that they offer. Sony Pictures. I mean, they did all these other things, and that's where they made their bread and butter. And once they entered PlayStation, which seemed at the beginning, excuse me, I'm freaking out here. Which at the beginning it was a very adolescent thing for Sony. Thought they were, like video games were toys. They didn't want to get into this business. And sure enough, 20 years later, it's their most profitable venture. And it's the number one thing for the Sony Corporation as a whole is PlayStation, And the CEO right now was once the president and CEO of just PlayStation Division. Kaz Hirai was the CEO of PlayStation. And then he just graduated right up to Sony Corporation CEO. And the very fact that he's up there at the number one spot, that the company's focusing very much so on PlayStation. And just moving forward, it's just going to be one of those things where that's where all their money's going to go. And that's why they can do things like powers for PlayStation. That's why they can do things like, say, PlayStation Now. That's why they can do things like, say, maybe buy another developer, or at the very least justify doing such heavy R&D for things like PlayStation VR, which is a very big bet for Sony. We always talk about VR and the possibilities of how well it's going to do, and how it's such a monumental shift in gaming, and how it's not just some gimmick at this point, and this really is a major industry-wide push. And this is something that Sony was working on for well over a very long time before we even knew about it, before Oculus even announced their Kickstarter project. They have been investing a ton of money into this, and that's something Sony would have never done unless they knew that it was not only a surefire thing for them, but that it was part of gaming, and that's exactly what it's part of. It's the same thing like when PlayStation 3 lost Sony far upwards of $2 billion when Sony was selling the thing at a loss, and it just wasn't doing that very well. And they stuck by it, and then they stuck by doing extra peripherals for PlayStation 3, and moving on even forward to PlayStation 4, and having their great success with PlayStation 4, and making even bigger. And this is the thing, like with PlayStation VR, of course, is still more or less considered a peripheral, but it's a $400 peripheral, and that's an insane idea. And Sony can justify doing this because PlayStation is their frontline winner. So it's gonna be a really telling thing, say 20 years from now, and what Sony's going to be really doing. Are they going to have all these other ventures? Are they still going to be in mobile? Are they still going to be in television? Are they still going to have Sony Pictures? Or like for example, their PC business. They were in PC. They are not in that business anymore. They exited it. They sold it because it was hemorrhaging the company money. So when you've got PlayStation taking up 70 to upwards of 80% of the company's profit, what is Sony going to look like 20 years from now? And it's probably going to be Sony PlayStation. And who knows what else is going to be left. Those are some of the news stories I want to talk about with you guys this week. The Riiiide gaming topic was one that we have not covered. It's violent video games. That's always like a big topic for like a lot of people, and like news and media and all that ridiculous nonsense. You know how this conversation goes, but we finally covered this topic. And I always say we because obviously the video is just me talking for about 8 to 10 minutes usually, but it's a conversation in the comments too. So we finally touch on that topic, and by golly, do I want you all to watch it. or I will do what Kratos is doing to Helios. Spoiler alert. But it's not really a spoiler alert, because like that was like one of the first things we really saw from God of War 3 is like Kratos killing Helios. But that's besides the point. Keep submitting topics as always. And that's about it for some housekeeping. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Badecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I'll see you guys next Friday.